Okay, time to talk about strategic bombing, and after that, we shall wrap up how victory is achieved in this game. So, strategic bombing can only be conducted by these two guys, which is the two B-29 long-range bombers. One of them arrives in turn 9 for the Allies, and the second one arrives on turn 10. These two can only conduct strategic bombing if they are within range of Tokyo, so as you may see, the range is 8. So you can place them in some airfield within 8 hex range of Tokyo. Tokyo is this hex, so these two are good to go. And of course, that much late in the game, maybe you have also gained control of some hexes in Japan. But anyway, these hexes, if they are in range of Tokyo, then you can conduct strategic bombing. So once more, strategic warfare, which is submarine warfare and strategic bombing, is conducted at the beginning of the turn before the offensives phase. So first, submarine die is rolled, and if successful, it reduces the Japanese hand by 1 card. And then we conduct the strategic bombing, which is every B-29 long-range bomber in play rolls 1 die. If it is full strength, then it only fails on a die roll of 9 and succeeds in all other results. If it is reduced, then it only succeeds in a die roll of 0 to 4. Each successful strategic bombing roll further reduces the Japanese hand by 1 card, reminding it can only be reduced down to 4 cards for the Japanese, in which case they also receive 2 passes. Now, if at least one strategic bombing roll was successful, and even if the Japanese hand could not be further reduced, the Allies gain 1 political will. This can only be achieved once per turn. So, as you may guess, that late in the game, strategic bombing results in the political will victory drawing further and further away for the Japanese. Now, one way to place your B-29 bombers to conduct strategic bombing is within 8 hex range of Tokyo, but you will also recall that the Allies may place units in the air units in China box. And just reminding that you can place up to 2 air units there, and one of them may be a B-29 long-range bomber. And these units are in supply if either the Burma Road is open or the hump is active and the Allies control a supply-eligible airfield in northern India. So if they are in supply, they can conduct strategic bombing as normal. Upon their turn of arrival, so for example, at the beginning of turn 9, they can conduct strategic bombing as normal. But if they were eliminated and are placed as a replacement, then they cannot conduct strategic bombing in that same turn. The entry of these units as reinforcements cannot be delayed. And the B-29s that conducted strategic bombing cannot be used in offensives by the allied player for the rest of the turn, but if they are attacked, then they will fire back at the attackers. Additionally, if a B-29 bomber rolls a 9 during their strategic bombing attempt, they lose 1 step, which may possibly eliminate the unit. Unless the allies control an airfield which is within 5 hexes of Tokyo, just like this one, Iwo Jima, which can be the same hex the B-29 is located at. So as for victory, you might recall that after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, the US political will goes up from 0 to 8. So the Allies practically start on 8, and the Japanese have to reduce this down to 0 in order to achieve a political will victory. At the conclusion of the turn, after the offensives phase, we conduct the national status segment to check if certain countries have surrendered, and then the US political will segment to check whether political will is reduced for the US. And if it is on 0, then the Japanese win the game immediately. Now, let's check how political will is adjusted. When certain countries surrender, like Philippines, Malaya, Dutch East Indies, and Burma, then the Allies lose 1 political will for each one of those. These are practically the historical objectives that the Japanese managed to achieve. And then we've got the three big guys. If the Japanese make India or Australia or China surrender, then they gain two political will for each one. Practically, the allies lose two political will for each one of those. Also, if all of the above nations have surrendered, it's a further two political will lost for the allies. Just reminding that the allies may claim back the key locations that it takes for the nation to surrender, and they can reclaim the political will. So, for example, if they recapture Davao and Manila, then Philippines surrender is actually cancelled, and the allies gain their political will again. Now, there's a bunch more ways to adjust the political will, and let's focus on these two. For example, we've got Hawaii occupied, which means if at the end of the turn the Japanese are occupying either Oahu itself or Kauai or Hawaii or Midway for two consecutive political will segments, therefore for two consecutive turns, then the allies lose one political will, and this can only be achieved once per game. The allies can gain back political will in a variety of ways. The main one being recapturing these nations. And once more, I remind that if China or India surrender because they have got their own track and not certain locations you have to occupy, you cannot undo this, but you can undo the rest of the political will gains for the Japanese. And also, as we mentioned in the strategic bombing sections, you gain one political will if you succeed in strategic bombing, which is once per turn. And there are also two events that we might like to mention right now. One event is Bataan Death March, and the other one is Doolittle Raid. Each one has their own preconditions and effects. But just remember for now that there are two events that provide one political will to the allies each. And also, there are two events for the Japanese. One is Tokyo Rose that drops the allies' political will by one, and Tojo resigns, which drops the allies' political will by two. So actually, when US political will is at three or lower, the allies are in somewhat of a danger zone. Lastly, if the Japanese resources have dropped to 3 or less at the conclusion of any turn starting turn 5 or later, the allied player gains 3 political will, thus making the dream of a political win victory for the Japanese draw further and further away. Now let's move to Alaska. Alaska consists of these hexes, and the Japanese might like to occupy one of these five hexes, and historically they did occupy Atokiska and Adak. And if one of these five hexes is Japanese occupied on three consecutive US political will segments, then the Allies lose one political will due to Alaska occupied, which can again only be gained once per game. So, one way to achieve that would be, for example, to land in Dutch Alaska. And a smart move would be, because this one is out of reach of any Japanese headquarters, the move would be to, for example, redeploy one headquarters of yours to the game track. And after this one guy is eliminated for supply reasons, then during the next turn's reinforcements, you can bring back your headquarters and place back some reinforcements there and keep holding Dutch harbor, which is a pretty good port and airfield for you. And the other way would be just to not bother with Dutch harbor and go straight for Ratu Kiska, for example, which you can reach from Japan. And in this case, this unit is in range of the combined fleet in Japan, just barely. And it can survive the supply check here. And the allies have got 3 turns to dislodge him.
However, the occupation of either Alaska or Hawaii has to be continuous, which means a Japanese unit has to be continuously occupying Alaska for 3 turns, or Hawaii for 2 turns. So, for example, if this guy is here and the Americans manage to eliminate him, then if another guy lands at Amchitka, this does not fulfill the requirements for Alaska occupied. So this counter will reset and we will start counting 3 turns again from the beginning. However, let's not forget that according to the sequence of play, the attrition segment comes right after the US political will segment, which means if, for example, this guy is here and out of supply, and let's say for the sake of this example that the Japanese have been continuously occupying this hex for 2 turns, then during the third turn, the Americans will lose one political will because of Alaska being occupied for a third turn in a row, and then the attrition segment will result in this guy being eliminated. So the Allies will lose their political will. So a nice tactic for the Japanese would be to redeploy this guy when they get the chance to somewhere closer to Hawaii and Alaska. So the obvious example would be to move this guy from Hakodate to amphibiously assault with him onto Dutch Harbor, Alaska. And because this one will be attrited and eliminated due to supply attrition, the Japanese will, however, gain control of Dutch Harbor. And during the next turn's reinforcement segment, they might have redeployed Yamamoto somewhere else, and then they will be placing him here as reinforcements. And in this way, they can place their reinforcement and replacements here. And this might help them secure the occupation of Alaska and possibly Hawaii later on, because from here it is a much shorter distance to amphibiously invade Midway, which belongs to Hawaii, or Hawaii and Oahu itself. And there are some particular cards in the game that might help them do so, particularly Rear Admiral Matami Ungaki or Operation Me, Battle of Midway, which allows them a big ton of activations. And in this case, they might bring all their Kido Butai naval units. And with all these beefy guys, and possibly a weaker one to keep this plane occupied in Midway, they might be able to eliminate all the American Navy and Air Force. And after that, they might try some amphibious assault towards Hawaii. And as you might see, now all this stuff is within range of the combined fleet, so they will stay in supply after occupying Hawaii. And depending on the dice rolls, this might require a lot of attempts until you get a good dice roll and eliminate the enemy. Then you need to use your naval units to reduce this guy by 1 step, for example. And then this guy might complete the amphibious assault, or even use a follow-up amphibious assault to finish the task. And then Mr. Nimitz will have to move away and possibly be placed somewhere else. And this will not only result in one political will for the Japanese for the occupation of Hawaii, as well as one political will for the occupation of Alaska, so -2 for the Allies in total. But also, as you might recall, the Allies get one free naval replacement each turn as long as they control Oahu. So if the Japanese control it, they will deny these naval replacements as well every turn. And now, let's talk about this small spot, the air ferry.
This air ferry hex only indicates that an allied air unit can use this as a step between its legs for purposes of its air movement. But in no way can an allied unit end its movement here. It can just use it as a stepping stone to move further. So, for example, if the Japanese attack this air force in Midway, it cannot react to the battle by moving out of the hex and stay here. And of course, it cannot move further because it still has to participate in the battle, so it has to stay put in midway. Now, one more important feature of the game. Starting on turn 4, the allies have got the so-called progress of war to fulfill. So, starting on turn 4, they have to start making some progress of the war by capturing some hexes. And the number of hexes they have to capture is either 4 or their number of amphibious shipping points, whichever of the two is the lowest. So, typically, the allies will receive one ASP on turn 2 and then one ASP on every following turn. So, for example, in turn 4, in most cases, they will have 3 amphibious shipping points. So, their requirements in terms of progress of the war is 3 hexes captured. And after that, it will be raised up to 4. And it is never higher than 4. So, in order for a hex to count as captured by the Allies for progress of the war, it has to be Japanese control at the start of the offensive phase. So, for example, if during the turn the Japanese take control of one hex and the Allies recapture it, it does not count. You have to capture hexes that were originally controlled by the Japanese at the beginning of your turn. And it has to be a somewhat important location, which means a named location. Named locations are either cities or airfields or ports or resource hexes. So, for example, these ones are not named locations. They are neither cities, nor airfields, nor ports, nor resource hexes. They just have their names in italics for geographical purposes, but otherwise they do not count for progress of war because they are not strategically important. So even if you manage to dislodge the Japanese from Atto and Kiska, this will not count toward your progress of the war. And in many cases, in turn 4, you will face this kind of dilemma to either try to dislodge the Japanese from Alaska to avoid this one political will loss for Alaska, or pursue your progress of the war goals to avoid losing your political will this way. Some additional ways that the Allies can lose political will are the following. If during the US political will segment there is no US carrier left on the map, then the Allies lose one political will, and a further one political will if there is no US naval units of any type. So, as you may guess, for this check, Commonwealth carriers or naval units do not count. We are only counting US carriers or US naval units. So, it is usually a good strategy for the allies to hide one carrier of theirs somewhere safe, or at the very least, one naval unit in order to have something alive at the end of the turn. And depending on how the game goes, the Japanese might find it convenient to attack on Oahu just to destroy the US carriers or possibly all Japanese naval units. This may result in one or two political will. And these two political will gains may be achieved once per turn. And there's also a final way for the Americans to lose political will, which is during any offensive where they are the attacking force and as a result of ground combat, their whole ground force is eliminated, and one of the participating units was an American army unit of corps or division level. So one of these green guys, then they lose one political will. So I repeat, they have to be the attackers, and the entirety of their ground force has to be eliminated. And one of the units has to be a US Army unit of division or corps level. And as a final note, these should be units that can receive replacement. So, for example, if you lose this one guy, which is a pre-war unit that cannot receive a replacement, then this one does not count. There has to be a replaceable division or corps level unit. So, for example, if the allies are on a bind to conquer spaces, and they have to attack some one hex islands, for example, in which case first a marine unit has to go and then a US Army unit can follow. In this case, because of the die roll modifiers for amphibious assault, it is pretty likely that this might happen and the entire force is eliminated during the ground combat. Again, this can be gained once per turn for the Japanese, or rather lost for the Allies. Okay, so if a political will victory is not achieved by the Japanese, let's talk about how the Allies can win the game. There is practically three ways to do so. One way is to fully blockade the Japanese home islands, so deny their access to any resources. So, as mentioned earlier, the majority of the resource hexes are in Dutch East Indies and the Philippines and Malaya. And there's also three that begin under Japanese control, which is this one in Korea and these two in Manchuria. So it might be as simple as bringing some zone of influence all over the Japanese islands. And in this case, you have to try and trace a supply line between the resource hexes and the Japanese home islands, or rather, an ultimate supply source, which is these Japanese cities. So, for example, in this case, as you may see, not even these resources of Korea and Manchuria can reach Japan because of this network of zones of influence. So, we can safely assume that Japan is fully blockaded. So, this has to happen in three consecutive end of turn segments, which means at the very least you have to achieve this on turn 10 and maintain it during turns 11 and 12 as the allied player. So this is one way of obtaining victory. The second one is that Japan is successfully strategically bombed 4 times. So ever since the first arrival of the B-29 long-range bomber in turn 9, you succeed the strategic bombing on every turn, turns 9, 10, 11, and 12. Plus the Japanese control 1 or 0 resource hexes, and there is a B-29 bomber in range of Tokyo. So this one is pretty straightforward. But what about Japanese controlling one resource or less? This means you practically have to gain control of the Manchurian resources as well. And Manchuria is a special kind of area of the map where nobody can practically enter. And it's only after the play of Soviets invade Manchuria event that the Japanese lose these resources. This is a very special event in the Allied deck, which also causes a reshuffle of the deck at the end of the turn. But in order for this event to be playable, there has to be the event Tojo Resigns played by the Japanese player. And the event Tojo Resigns is the same one that drops the US political will by 2. And while it is at the Japanese player discretion to play it as an event or not in 1942 or 1943, starting 1944, the Japanese must play this card as an event. So they will reduce the US political will by 2, but this will allow the Soviets invade Manchuria event to take place, which means Soviet will invade these hexes and the Japanese will lose control of these two resources. Both these events, Tojo Resigns and Soviets invade Manchuria, cause a reshuffle to their respective decks, and they cannot be discarded or undo this reshuffle effect by any means. So recapping, if Japanese control 1 or 0 resource hexes, and they have strategically bombed successfully for 4 consecutive turns, and a B-29 long-range bomber is in range of Tokyo, then the Japanese lose the game due to the so-called A-bomb victory. But this is a conditional one because it requires the play of Soviets invade Manchuria event. And the final one, if as the Allies you have failed to either achieve a bomb victory or the blockade victory, is the occupation of Japan, which means invading Japan and gaining control of all cities in Honshu. In this case, and only in this case, the Japanese will surrender. But there is a special feature here, which is these red boxes. These indicate that the Japanese have got an intrinsic ground step of 12 attack and 12 defense in each such hex. And this is always the last ground step to be eliminated. So, for example, if there is a ground step here, in addition to the intrinsic one, then the Allies may try and bombard it with some naval or air units, and they may eliminate this ground step, but the intrinsic one will always stay alive and it has to be taken down by force. So the final way for the Allies to win is by landing some guy, for example, here or here, and after taking down the garrison one by one, if they manage to control all hexes, then they win the game. But notice that after they eliminate one garrison, even if the hex later returns under Japanese control, the garrison is not resurrected, it is done for once and for all. So this is the hardest way to do things, and historically the Americans tried to avoid to have to do this by any means because it would take an effort multiple times than what it took for D-Day. It would be very bloody and the Japanese would fight to their last one, of course. But gameplay wise, in the case you have not managed to achieve the A-bomb victory or the Japanese home islands blockade victory, this will be your last resource to end the game. And if none of these three is achieved by the end of turn 12, then the Japanese win. So that's it, guys. We are finished. We have reached the end. Congratulations. You have survived all supply attrition checks. You're alive. And I will not bother you with any more strategic talks right now. Hopefully a playthrough will soon follow to see the mechanics of the game being displayed in action. And what better way would there be to conclude this tutorial video series by reciting the official surrender statement of Japanese leadership signed in September 2, 1945 in the US ship Missouri and signed by our beloved General MacArthur in account of the USA, plus the leadership of all countries involved like Japan, United Kingdom, Soviet Union and China. Let's go!
加盟はここに合衆国、通過民国を呼び、グレートブリテン国の政府の主犯が1945年7月26日、ポツダムにおいてはしごに、ソビエト社会主義共和国連邦が参加したる宣言の続行を日本国天皇、日本国政府を呼び日本帝国大本営の命により勝つ。これに代理ズダグス右四国は以下これを連合国と称す。加盟はここに日本帝国大本営並みに何例の一に在留をものはず、一切の日本国軍隊及び日本国の支配下に在留一切、軍隊の連合国に対する無条件降伏を布告す。加盟はここに何例の一に在留をものはず、一切の日本国軍隊及び日本国市民に対し敵対行為を直に終止すること。一切の船舶、航空機並みに軍用及び非軍用財産の保存しの撃損を防止すること及び、連合国最高司令官またはそれの指示に聞き日本国政府の書記官と化すべき一切の要求に応ずることを追ず。加盟はここに日本帝国大本営が何例の一に在留をものはず、一切の日本国軍隊及び日本国の支配下に在留。一切の軍隊の指揮官に対し自身の呼びそれの支配下に在る。一切の軍隊が無条件に降伏すべき旨の命令を直に発することを追いず。 亀はここに一切の関東、陸軍の予備海軍の職員に対し連合国最高司令官が本降伏実施のため適当なりと認めて自ら発し、またはそれの委任に基づき発ししむる一切の不合命令及び指示を遵守しかつ、これを施行することを追いちなみに右職員が連合国最高司令官により、またはそれの委任に基づき、特に任務を変えざるきり国自の地位に止めりかつ引き続き、各自の非戦闘的任務を行ふことを追いず。加盟はここにポツダム宣言の条項を誠実に履行すること並みに右宣言を実施するため、連合国最高司令官またはそれの他特定の連合国代表者が要求することあるべき一切の命令を発しかつかかる一切の措置を取ることを天皇、日本国政府及びそれの後継者のために訳す。加盟はここに日本帝国政府及び日本帝国大本営に対し現に日本国の支配下に在る一切の連合国不良及び非抑留者を直に解放すること並みにそれの保護、手当、救助及び指示せられたる場所への即時輸送のための措置を取ることを追いず。天皇及び日本国政府の国家統治の権限は反降伏条項を実施するため、適当と認める措置を取る連合国最高司令官の制限の下に置かれるものとする。1945年9月2日午前9時4分、日本国東京湾上において署名す。